How do you now go from this to this? I'll show you my process step by step. First, identify the main melody and the instrument that will perform it. In this case, it's pretty obvious that the main melody is and in my opinion, it demands to be performed by a horn section. Secondly, I want to start creating a percussion bed. I want to outline the rhythm, but I'm not going to overdo it because I already know that the strings will be kind of percussive. So I'll just use timpani, bass drum and snare. I'm actually going to start with the timpani because they are tuned, so they'll work as a bridge between the percussion and the other low instruments that will be added in a bit. As you can hear, the timpani are not just playing on the 1, 2, 3, 4, but they're also outlining the chords from our sketch, which are A minor, F minor, A minor, C minor. Let's hear the timpani and horn together. Next, I want to add the bass drum. It's just going to accentuate the main beats, and you might argue that it's not super present, but it actually contributes a lot to the overall arrangement. I want a marching snare, and I want it to suggest that we're in 6/8, but without being obnoxious. Okay, so our rhythm section is not complete. Based on the fact that the main melody is assigned to the horns, I already know that the brass section is going to be quite prominent in the overall arrangement. Therefore, the strings will serve as our main rhythm section in this case. Let's start with the cellos. As you can hear, the cellos have that great 6/8 pattern going on. For the double bass, I want something lighter, because overdoing any sub-instrument in a busy arrangement is never a good idea. So the double basses are just accentuating the main notes from the actual bass line, which is A, F, A, C. Next, the violas. Hear me out, the violas are crucial and I definitely want some movement in my violas. So I'll write a pattern that is both rhythmic, melodic and touches the third of each chord, thus highlighting the harmonies. I'm gonna use the first violins to add some sparkle to this section. The second violin pizzicato simply adds a percussive touch to the section in this case. I needed to bear in mind that I generally add every new instrument by performing it on a keyboard, and I do it whilst listening to the rest of the instruments that are already there, because that's going to affect the dynamics of my performance. However, I'm just showing some of the instruments on their own so that you can hear the individual voices better. Let's now have a quick listen at the whole string section. And with the percussion and horns. Let's move to the brass section. Because our main melody is performed by 6 horns in unison, I want the trombones to play chords so that they can fill the gap in the mids and complement the horns. Then with the rest. The tuba is actually playing the same notes as the timpani. It doesn't have to, but as I said, I don't want clutter in my lows, so I'd rather have the tuba playing a simple staccato pattern like this. Now the woodwinds. Woodwinds are always really important if you want to achieve a traditional symphonic sound. I have the bassoons playing some simple staccatos in octaves. Remember that if you overdo the bassoons in a busy arrangement like this, they will clog the lower mids. So if I wanted them to play all the time, I would have probably trimmed down the cellos a bit. Then the clarinets play a faster pattern. Notice how the clarinets, violas, cellos, and snare work together, outlining that 6/8. There's only one element from the percussion section that I left until last on purpose, the tubular bells. So that the whole percussion sounds like this. And I think it's a good idea to leave bright tuned percussion until the end. Instruments like glockenspiel, celesta, tubular bells, because I see it more like a finishing touch to add sparkle to the arrangement. But of course, there will be times where you need to bring them on earlier, if they're playing an important melody, for example. Let's just have a final listen to the whole arrangement. Our previous example of orchestration was brass-driven, with the horns playing the main melody and the trombones occupying a lot of space with loud, full chords. I now want to explore another common scenario where the strings are more prominent. We have this piano sketch. And we're going to turn it into this. For this type of situation, I usually start with a foundation of lows, cellos and double basses. As you can hear, they play the same thing in octaves. I want the low strings to have some dynamics going on, but not too much in this case, because I want a consistent foundation. I'm immediately going to add a second line of cellos. Divisi are common practice in orchestral music. Divisi means divided in Italian, and it's the word we use in orchestration whenever an instrument that usually has a single line, like cellos, violas, violins, has multiple things going on instead. That's what we call divisi, and they can be written on the same stave or on separate staves. So the second cello line tells us a bit more about the chords. Now the violas. Remember that I always want some movement in my violas. I feel ready to add the main melody, which is played by the first and second violins in octaves. When you get to this stage and you have a full string arrangement, you have basically two options. You can stop here, add a tiny bit of light percussion or other elements if you wish, then just double check the dynamics and move on to the mixing. Or you could go for the full arrangement, which is what I'm doing in this case. But if you were writing a quiet intro or an interlude, you could actually almost stop here. I'm gonna add the brass. I want the brass to play full chords and complement the strings, but I want the brass to play softly so that they don't take away from the strings. These chords are split between horns, trombones, and tuba. Let's hear strings and brass together. Time to add the percussion. In this type of arrangement, I want the percussion to sound big, but quiet at the same time. In order to achieve that, I'm gonna use multiple instruments, but I'm gonna play them very softly. Monster drums, then a single bass drum playing even more sparingly, then some taiko drums, and orchestral toms on top. Still not happy, so I'm gonna add a bass drum ensemble with a slightly different pattern. Let's hear the whole percussion section. And now with the strings and brass. We're not done yet. I'm adding a clarinet pattern to create more movement. And then flutes and oboes in unison, doubling the first violins. I would normally have flutes and oboes in octaves, but they also sound great in unison. And in this case, I only want to highlight the first violins. The second violins don't need any extra support in my opinion in this case. I'm adding one hit of cymbals at the beginning of the phrase, and this would be a great time to add any other shiny percussion to your arrangement should you want to. I think it just needs two final additions. A second line of violas playing staccato to accentuate the rhythm, notice how these additional violas are playing very similar notes to the clarinets. And let's hear the string section with the added violas. And last but not least, a boys' choir, which will glue things together. And this is the full arrangement. In our third case study, we're going to take a look at a percussion-driven arrangement. So here's the piano sketch. And here's the arrangement. As you can hear, I'm not using the whole orchestra in this case, because I need space for the percussion. I'm gonna start with the monster drums. The secret here is to use a variety of big and small drums. The big ones will cover the low end, and the small ones will create the rhythm. Compared to the previous example, we can have louder dynamics overall, but not too loud either, because the tone will come from the sum of all the different drums. The orchestral bass drum plays a very simple part. Things start getting a bit busier with the taiko. And then the toms. Plus, I'm going to add this bass drum ensemble, which actually has a crispy sound. All the drums together sound like this. Notice how some of the hits are not perfectly aligned, which contributes to the realism. More about this in the next module. Next, I'm going to add the double basses. I need some sustained notes now. I could use strings, brass, but for this one I want low male voices. And the bed of our arrangement is ready. I feel ready to add the main melody, which will be performed by a solo cello. Notice that F sharp in the melody and the choir, reminding us of the epic Dorian quality of this tune. Now a few finishing touches. Only on the first downbeat, I want harpsichord and tam-tam. Just to accentuate the beginning of the phrase. And then I want a soft counter melody with some rhythm, so I'm gonna use the harp. Let's hear how it works in conjunction with the cello. And so we have the full arrangement. We've taken into account 3 completely different scenarios. What are the key takeaways? Your piano sketch actually contains a lot of information about the arrangement that will be. The melody, depending on the phrasing, usually demands to be played by a certain instrument, like horn, violins, flute, or a solo instrument, like cello, oboe, and so on. So listen to that melody and try to imagine what instrument will translate it best. If you're not certain, try a few options and find the one that works. Your piano sketch also tells you a lot about the tempo, the pace, whether you need long sustained notes to support the main melody, or a busy rhythmic section instead. It's not binding, and I'm not saying that the arrangement is necessarily predetermined. Otherwise, we wouldn't see things such as a song that gets rearranged in a completely different way. But in most cases, the piano sketch will have a few arrangement options that work great for it, and other arrangement options that may sound a bit unnatural. What instrument should you work on first? I'd say for strong melodies, like the horn melody in our first example, start from that and then build your foundational percussion, low instrument, etc. like we did. The percussion was second because it was kind of a priority to achieve that marching sound. For full but soft arrangement like the second example, I'd start from a foundation of lows and then work my way up. Once the main section is complete, in our example it was the strings, I'd see if it needs help from another section. We added some quiet brass in order to make the chords sound fuller. Only then I would actually add the percussion, which if you remember from the example was more in the background. For percussion-driven arrangements like the third example, I would instead start from the drums and build a full percussion ensemble. Then I'd work on the bass and also add some sustained chords before worrying about the melody. Ultimately, I think you could start from anywhere, but it's good practice to establish your priorities in the arrangement and work on those first. It's gonna make everything easier and you'll get better results in less time. I started this module with practical examples because I wanted to show you what you can do. Now, it's time to pause for a second and take a look at some of the background information that we left behind. The orchestra consists of 4 main sections: strings, woodwinds, brass and percussion. The strings are first violins, second violins, violas, cellos and double basses. The woodwinds are flutes, oboes, clarinets and bassoons. The brass section is horns, trumpets, trombones and bass tuba. The percussion section contains both unpitched instruments and tuned instruments. Unpitched is the snare, the bass drum, the cymbals. The sound they produce is still a note, but they're not used to create melodies. Tuned percussion are the timpani, tubular bells, the mallets and so on. Then you can also have all sorts of keyboard instruments: celesta, piano, harpsichord, pipe organ. And of course the harp, which can be either considered a part of the string family or a part of the percussion family. The traditional way to organize an orchestral score visually is to have the woodwinds at the top, then the brass, percussion, then harp, keyboards and strings. Within each section, the instruments are organized from high to low. So for the woodwinds we have flutes, oboes, clarinets and bassoons. And for the strings, violins first, second, violas, etc. It works like this for all the sections. The only exception are the horns, which are at the top of the brass section, just above the trumpets, even though the horns play in a lower range compared to the trumpets. I came across multiple explanations for this. As a matter of fact, the horns blend perfectly with the brass, of course, but they also blend perfectly with the woodwinds. So you can think of them as a bridging instrument between the two sections, even though in most cases you're going to orchestrate them with the brass. The most amazing thing about the orchestra is that each section is actually self-sufficient. There's plenty of music for strings only, for woodwinds ensemble, for brass ensemble, and also for percussion ensemble. So the orchestra really is this multifunctional organism made of subunits, where each subunit is actually a little orchestra of its own. This is very important because if it's true on one hand that you can sum all the instruments and achieve a massive sound, it is also true on the other hand that you can have moments in your arrangement where one of the sections takes over almost completely. And you can alternate moments where the strings are the protagonist, moments where the brass is the protagonist, etc. Now, whenever you're arranging one section of the orchestra, I want you to keep this distribution in mind. This is oversimplified, and you don't need to achieve this exact distribution each time. But please take a look at what I did. We have the root note, the octave, then the fifth, then another octave, then another fifth, then another octave, then the third and the fifth. So, in other words, I'm spreading the chord over the keyboard, trying to use mostly octaves and fifths in the lower range, saving the actual triad for the mid-range or the high range of the keyboard. If I did this with a string section instead of a piano, you would see that the root note is assigned to the double basses, the octave to the cellos, fifth and octave to the violas, then fifth and octave to the second violins, then third and fifth to the first violins. As I said, I'm oversimplifying this, and it doesn't mean that you can't have your triad around the mid-range of the keyboard. Or even lower. But as a rule of thumb, if I want to create dense harmonies in the lows, I'm gonna do it in segments of the track where those lower harmonies have the space to develop, which means there's not much going on above them in the mid-range and in the high range. Whereas, realistically, if the dense harmonies are in the mid-range and or in the high range, which is a very common scenario, I will leave more gaps in the lows. You can of course also use chord inversions in your arrangement. So these two chords, A major and F major, are both in first position, with the root notes being the lower notes. But if I do this instead, I'm going to have A major first inversion with its third being the lowest note, and F major second inversion with its fifth being the lowest note. Both solutions are absolutely valid, and you can play with other combinations as well. Which one will work for your specific arrangement depends on your preference and how you wish to move the parts, because as you can hear from the example, they sound very different. Same chords, but with a different intention and direction. The first version being more assertive, and the second one more intriguing. Another general rule is that if you want a full sound for each section, you're gonna spread your chords and have them covering multiple octaves. So each instrument is gonna have multiple lines going on. On the other hand, if you want a focused sound, you're gonna have groups of instruments playing the same note. And by that I mean that in the first example, if you have, let's say, 3 trombones, 4 horns and 2 trumpets, you will have 3 different lines in the trombones, 2 in the horns, and 2 more in the trumpets. Whereas in the second example, you'd have 3 trombones playing in unison, 4 horns playing in unison, and 2 trumpets playing in unison. This is relevant to the writing because if you read a symphonic score, you'll see a note saying a tre in Italian every time the composer wants those 3 trombones or flutes or clarinets to play in unison. And it's also relevant to the production aspects because you need to be picking a sample patch with the individual trombones in the first case, and a sample patch with the 3 or more trombones playing in unison in the second case. The effect is completely different, and if you check any sheet music from the greats, you'll notice that whenever they're going for a huge sound, they'll cover more octaves and spread the chords, saving the unisons, let's say 3 trumpets or 4 horns in unison, mostly for situations where that line needs to stick out. It's worth mentioning that for woodwinds and brass, the default is that you have multiple melodic lines on a stave. So if you have 3 flutes, you're going to have 3 lines on the stave, unless otherwise stated with the a tre note, where the composer says they should all 3 play in unison. Whereas for the strings, if you have the first violin stave, for example, the default is that you have 14 or more first violins playing in unison. And then you'll have 5 total staves for the strings. 1 for the first violins, 1 for the second violins, 1 for the violas, 1 for the cellos, and 1 for the double basses. Unless the composer wants to split some of the lines, in which case they'll divide one of the string instruments into 2 or more divisi staves. So it's interesting how the default for strings and woodwinds is not the same, and this has an impact on the arranging process. Let's now take a look at the specifics of each section, starting with the strings. The strings are capable of a variety of articulations. Some of the most common ones are staccato, pizzicato, legato, tremolo. You'll find variations of these 4, and of course you'll find many more. I recommend that you familiarize with the articulations so that you can decide what to use depending on the situation. Now let's say that you have the first and second violins playing the same line in octaves. This is a very common scenario. Let's also say that you have cellos and double basses playing the bass line in octaves. If you put them together, the result is okay, but it feels a bit empty. Obviously, you could fill the gap with other sections, and in some cases you will, but I bet you noticed that we haven't put our violas to use, and you'll find that neglecting the violas or simply not knowing what to do with them is a common problem. So I'll give you 2 options for this example. In the first option, the viola go up and down, arpeggiating the chords and bridging the high strings with the low strings, but also creating movement. Listen closely. For the second option, the violas will simply play long notes and fill that gap. Notice how the violas and second violins, in this case, are complementing each other, forming the full triads. The role of the violas is pivotal, and they also have a unique tone that you can use both for melodic lines and for action sequences. Expanding the string section, should you want to, is pretty straightforward. You can use the divisi concept that we saw earlier on and split your violas, your cellos, or any instrument from the string section into 2, 3, or even more. However, I suggest that you first try arranging the strings with just the 5 standard lines, and then, if necessary, split them. The brass section is dynamic and powerful. It can be really loud and take over the entire arrangement easily. Let's see some of the most common articulations that brass instruments can perform. Staccato, sustain, legato, sforzato, marcato. Sustain means that each long note has its own attack, whereas legato means that one note goes into the next one with a smooth transition. Sforzato has a really emphasized attack. Marcato is a sustained note with a slightly emphasized attack. The brass section is versatile. It can do the epic, it can do the quirky, it can be soft and introspective. How do you go about arranging the brass section? First, you need to establish its role in your arrangement. Is the brass the protagonist or is it in the background? Second, if the brass is the protagonist, there's going to be a main brass melody, and I recommend that you work on that melodic line before arranging the rest of the section. The role of the brass can change throughout the arrangement, so it's something you need to assess one segment of the track at a time. Let's have a look at what happens when the brass is mainly supporting the other sections. If you remember our string-driven arrangement, the brass here supports the strings. It gives depth to the whole arrangement, whilst staying in the background. In this case, the brass is playing chords, with the horns playing 2 lines, the trombones another 2, and the bass tuba 1. You can also have situations where the brass, especially the low brass, together with the low strings and percussion, join forces to drive the rhythm of the track. In this case, the cellos are doing a lot of the work, whilst trombones and tuba accentuate some of the notes. This is the sort of orchestral bed that could support a main melody played on the strings, the horns, a choir, etc. What happens when the brass is the protagonist? You pick the main line and assign it to a brass instrument, depending on the range and the desired tone. I'm going with the horns for this one. Then you create a bed with the rest of the brass section. Let's hear it without the horns. All the notes of this brass accompaniment derive from the chords that I imagine with this melody. Nothing fancy. 3 lines of trombones, bass tuba, and a touch of trumpet at the end. I want these chords to support the main melody. I don't want to cover it, therefore I'm not adding any more lines. And also I was mindful with the dynamics so that the horns stick out. In this type of situation, you want an ensemble, let's say 4 horns, 6 or 8, to perform the melody in unison. Bear that in mind when you pick the sample patch. Whereas you usually want to have split lines for the other instruments, trombones in this case. So I picked a single trombone patch and performed the 3 lines. This is important because it affects the writing and the production aspect. With that being said, there will be situations where you pick a patch of 3-4 trombones playing in unison and use it to perform multiple lines, ending up with 9 or more total trombones in order to achieve a huge sound. The brass can also be very impactful when arranged in octaves. You can, for example, have the horns and trombones playing in octaves. You can do trombones and tuba, trumpets and horns. You can even do them all four at once. For this kind of situation, you definitely want the sample patches with 4 or more horns playing in unison, 3 or more trombones, 3 or more trumpets playing in unison. Voicing matters a lot in music composition and arrangement in general. Voicing, in regard to the arrangement of the brass, always requires extra attention. Take these 3 chords, for example. They sound a lot different if I rearrange them like this. Both solutions are valid, but one of the two could be more appropriate than the other, depending on the context. Expanding the brass section can be done by adding instruments to the 4 existing ones. You can add the piccolo trumpet, the bass trumpet, the bass trombone, the Wagner tubas, the contrabass tuba, all with their specific range and tone, which can enrich your brass ensemble. However, for most situations, the 4 usual ones will be more than enough. Let's hear some of the common articulations for the Woodwinds family. Staccato, sustain, legato, sforzato, marcato. Pretty similar to what we saw with the brass. The role of the woodwinds is absolutely crucial, and getting them right should be a priority for you. They can, of course, perform solo melodies accompanied by other sections. But their main strength is that they can support the other sections so well and blend with them, adding texture and making everything better. Let's have a quick look at an arrangement for woodwinds. The main melody is played by the flutes, whilst the oboes create some harmonies. The clarinets play a pattern. Similarly to what we saw with the violas, it's great to have movement in the clarinets. And the bassoons play this simple bass melody that covers the root notes of the chords and complements the clarinets. A great addition to this woodwind arrangement would be the harp. Let's hear everything together. Harp and woodwinds mix really well. It goes without saying that you could be using the oboe, the clarinet or the bassoon for your lead melody, depending on the register and the tone you're going for. Now, as I said, I believe that the woodwind's main strength in the context of orchestral production is the power to blend with other sections, the ability to make the strings or the brass sound better. But how do you go about pairing the woodwinds with the other instruments? You can pair them with the brass, you can pair them with the strings, or you can mix the two strategies up. Let's go with the brass first. You have this brass section. It's one line of trumpets, one of horns, one of trombones, and one of bass tuba. And the most immediate thing that you can do is to double them in octaves with the woodwinds. This means that the flutes will play the same line as the trumpets, one octave up. The oboes will double the horns an octave up. The clarinets will double the trombones an octave up. And the bassoons will double the bass tuba an octave up. It's such a straightforward process, but it works so well. Definitely a great starting point for many situations. How about pairing the woodwinds with the strings instead? Let's take this arrangement for example. This is very simple. No divisi, one line of first violins, one of second violins, one of violas, one of cellos, and one of double basses. The second violins and violas form chords whilst harmonizing the main melody. Cellos and double basses play the root notes and are organized in octaves. The most immediate thing we can do is to double the lines with the woodwinds. This time, however, it's going to be in unison rather than octaves. First violins with flutes, second violins with oboes, violas with clarinets, cellos with bassoons. And this is how it sounds when you put them together with the strings. A great addition to this would be the harp. Not only the harp complements the woodwinds and the strings, it also creates movement. What if you wanted to create the same movement without having to use the harp? You could make a second line of violas or perhaps clarinets. In this example, I started from the previous arrangement I split the flutes so that the second flute line would be the one that originally belonged to the clarinets. And I wrote a more dynamic clarinet line, similar to what the harp was doing in the previous version. Here's the final result. I'm also gonna give you an alternative solution where we don't necessarily just double the strings with the woodwinds. What if we had the flutes playing chords, then the clarinets reinforcing the same chords an octave below, the bassoon doubled the cellos, no changes there, and the oboes play the same line as the first violins in unison. This is how it sounds together with the strings. It's a much fuller sound compared to the previous example. It's not better, they're just two different approaches that you could use as a starting point for different situations. You can also introduce secondary melodies. This oboe melody imitates the first violins initially and then finds its own way. You can obviously play with the octaves. I gave you examples where the woodwinds double the strings by matching the octave, or they double the brass one octave up. But you could try all sorts of combinations as long as you keep in mind the actual range of each instrument and the fact that some instruments might produce a different sound in certain parts of their range, which could be more or less pleasant, more or less in line with the sound you're going for. You can also split the woodwinds. For example, the bassoons and the clarinets, or just the bassoons, could reinforce the low brass, whilst the rest of the woodwinds could play together with the strings. Or the other way around, low woodwinds and low strings together, high woodwinds and high brass together. In some cases, you're going to have the low strings, low brass, low woodwinds, and percussion locking together to create a rhythmic section. Although if you do that, you have to be careful not to clog up the lows and lower mids. So, you might want to assign the full rhythmic pattern to one or two sections at most, and use the remaining sections to accentuate some of the notes, adding texture and depth. I encourage you to play with all these combinations and find the ones that work for you depending on the tracks you're writing. We've already seen how the violas and clarinets can work well in unison, as well as cellos and bassoons in unison. But you can also have violas and bassoons in unison, or trombones and bassoons. A great sound is obtained by doubling the horns with oboes on the same octave and then adding flutes an octave above. This works in the upper register of the horns because you want those oboes on the same octave in this case. Not only this is great because it adds texture to the horns, but it makes the melody stand out even more, so it can be useful for busy arrangements. In the lower register, you can combine the horns with the bassoons, and they blend so well that you almost create the illusion of a third horn line. One might argue that we're using virtual instruments and we could write as many horn lines as we want, which is true. However, this is a very practical solution and it sounds great, so I would totally recommend that you experiment with it as well. Expanding the woodwind section can be a lot of fun because you have so many options. With flutes alone, you can add the piccolo flute, you can add the alto flute, and the bass flute. Usually you don't need them all, but the piccolo flute can be useful for melody that need to stand out. You can use it to double the flutes or the violins. You can use it for runs and effects. The English horn and the oboe d'amore belong to the oboes family. The English horn plays in a slightly lower range compared to the oboe, and it has its own distinctive sound that lends itself to lyrical passages. The basset horn and the bass clarinet belong to the clarinet family, whilst the contrabassoon is the big brother of the bassoon. So, as you can see, you have plenty of instruments to pick from should you want to expand your woodwind section in order to achieve a specific tone. And that's without counting recorders, historic instruments such as the cram horn or the baroque oboe, traditional instruments such as the tin whistle or the bagpipe. Having said that, you can get a lot done with the 4 regular woodwinds, and in most cases, I'd recommend that you try to arrange your music using those 4 before bringing in any more woodwinds. What if you orchestrate without woodwinds? It can be what you're going for. There are many modern tracks that just use strings, percussion, brass, and perhaps synths. It's a style and it gives you that 2015 trailer music sound. On the other hand, if you're going for a full symphonic sound, the woodwinds are going to be extremely important. It doesn't mean that you have to use the whole woodwind section all the time. In fact, there's nothing that you must be doing to begin with. But you can see how the approaches that I showed you in this module can get you halfway through the development of a full orchestral sound. And then it's down to your taste, preference, style, and what you're trying to communicate to your audience. Of course, you can use orchestral percussion to create rhythmic patterns, but you can also use it to highlight certain things, such as transitions or melodies, or you can use it in a very subtle way to create interesting textures. There are two types of percussion instruments, pitched and unpitched. With the unpitched percussion such as the snare drum, bass drum, orchestral toms, cymbals, taiko, anvils, and many more, you can create patterns and you can emphasize the rhythm that is already present in the other sections. Also, if you remember the percussion-driven arrangement that we saw a bit earlier, whenever you need depth in your percussion, you might want to combine different instruments. More often than not, you'll notice that soft hits on different drums, such as the bass drum, toms, and taiko all together, result in a fuller sound compared to just one loud stroke on a bass drum, for example. The anvil is a fascinating instrument, but it can sound really thin on its own. You can combine it with a snare drum and one of the bigger drums to create a more impactful sound. With the pitch percussion or tune percussion, you have a lot of expressive possibilities. The timpani, for example, allow you to make rhythmic patterns that have melody as well. The timpani blend perfectly with the drums, but also with the low strings or the low brass. You can use the timpani for marching sections, but also to sustain the low notes of melodic passages, in which case they can either accompany a low string pizzicato or low strings long notes. Other pitched percussion instruments are the mallets, bells of all sorts, crotales, and more. The mallets are beautiful instruments. They can be made of metal, like the vibraphone and glockenspiel, or wood, like the marimba and xylophone. They cover a big range, with the marimba going reasonably low and the glockenspiel and xylophone covering the higher octaves. You can use them as solo instruments, but you can also use them to highlight something else in your arrangement. The marimba has interesting lows and sometimes you can use it in an arrangement instead of a low string pizzicato. Also, the marimba lends itself to quirky melodies. The vibraphone, especially with the motor on, has a dreamy sound with a long decay. That you can use to create texture and works well in conjunction with the clarinet. The xylophone has a punchy wooden sound that pokes through any arrangement, and you can use it, for example, together with the flutes or other wind instruments for fast melodies or transitions. The glockenspiel has a brilliant, high-pitched, metallic sound and it can be used as a really bright music box. It can be used to create light, ethereal melodies that soar over the rest of the orchestra, and it's perfect for doubling the high strings or the flutes. In this case, the glockenspiel is playing one octave higher than the flute, but it could be on the same octave, depending on the height of the melody and the desired effect. You can see a pattern here. Woodwinds and mallets work really well together, and I recommend experimenting with all the different combinations. The percussion section also includes the crotales, which are tiny metal discs, a variety of bells, such as the tubular bells, plate bells, sometimes church bells, and more. There are two things that I want to highlight here. If you put together all the bells, plus the vibraphone, the glockenspiel, the crotales, and later on we're gonna see the celesta, you have a wide range of tuned metallic percussion, which means that you can always find the right type of shiny metal percussion for the melody or the passage that you're working on. I'm not saying that you should overdo it, rather be aware that these instruments are there for when you need them. Even the bigger sounding bells have a huge dynamic range and are capable of rendering very soft parts, creating beautiful textures, so they're not just for hits and loud parts. You can also include keyboards in your orchestral layout: piano, harpsichord, pipe organ, celesta, and even synths. In the context of each arrangement, you need to decide whether a specific keyboard is going to be a solo instrument or if it's going to blend with the rest of the orchestra in order to create nuances. Of course, this can change throughout the tune, but generally speaking, the role of a keyboard will affect the way you write the part, as well as affecting the mix down the line. Take the piano, for example. Of course, it can be used as a solo instrument, but it can also be used to emphasize the percussion, to double the low strings, to double the low brass, and so on. The celesta can be considered a percussion instrument, but it's played by a pianist. It's perfect for rendering a mellow music box. It has a range of several octaves, sometimes up to 5.5, depending on the manufacturer. And for most uses, I suggest that you treat it like a gentler sibling of the glockenspiel. The harp is a wonderful instrument with a huge range and a versatile tone. It blends well with the strings, it blends well with the woodwinds, as we've seen in some of the previous examples. It blends well with the percussion. Hear how much it adds to a simple string arrangement. The harp is not loud, but you can use it to highlight transitions, perhaps in conjunction with the timpani and the clarinet. Feel free to try other combinations as well. When writing for harp, remember that it has a special pedal system that allows the player to introduce alterations. Therefore, it can be hard to move to a different key mid-phrase, especially if it's a distant key, one that doesn't share many common tones with the previous one. It's not necessarily a problem if you're using virtual instruments, but it can have an impact on the overall realism of the music. And if your tune needs to be performed live at some point, this can be an issue. If you use two harps, however, you can distribute the key changes more conveniently, so bear that in mind. Two harps are also great to accompany fast rhythmic sections. Instead of playing fast repetitions on one harp, you can alternate the same note on two different octaves on the first harp, and then do the same things but reversed on the second harp. So that when you put them together, you get this. In the first module of this course, we also mentioned octatonic music. The interesting thing about octatonic work is that you can arrange it in so many different ways because it doesn't have some of the constraints of tonal and modal music. Remember what I said earlier about the distribution of the chords across the octaves and across the different instruments. Whenever you're arranging one section of the orchestra, I want you to keep this distribution in mind. With octatonic music, you have more freedom in that respect, because it's atonal, and even jarring things such as clusters of notes can work well in the context of an octatonic arrangement. It's up to you how far you want to push it and how dissonant the result will be. Let's see a practical example. This is an octatonic melody. I'm gonna start the arrangement with the vibraphone. Then I'm gonna set up a descending pattern with horns in octaves and double them in the second half of the phrase with clarinets and bass clarinet. Just using notes from the same scale, I'm gonna create an ascending pattern with the first violins. And some movement in the second violins. Let's hear this together with the rest. Now I'm gonna go crazy with the violas. I'll create another pattern with the cellos and cross it with a double bass line that starts in the high register of the double bass by imitating what the cellos just did. I'm also going to add a medium hit of tam-tam and some timpani rolls. Let's just hear what I did up to now. I could carry on adding instruments in order to create a denser texture. But the point is that this harmonic implant gives you a lot of freedom and it's fun to orchestrate octatonic music. So it's definitely something that I would experiment with if I were you. One thing that I want you to consider is how the arrangement translates to the mix. A good mix can fix a bad arrangement, but a good arrangement always translates to a better mix. The clarity that you're looking for in your mix is a byproduct of your instrument choice and performance. Think about the lows and lower mids, for example. On one hand, we have to allow for frequency overlap in that region because the low strings, low brass, low woodwinds, and percussion coexist in a good arrangement. On the other hand, we must find the sweet spot because otherwise we might end up clogging that area of the spectrum and then it's gonna be hard to fix the low-end mess at the mixing stage. Please don't be discouraged if things don't turn out perfect the first time around or the second. Orchestration involves trial and error, and learning how to do it only happens if you allow yourself to try different things, make mistakes, be unhappy about the results, and start from scratch. All the things that we saw in this module give you a framework with different strategies that you can use as a starting point for different situations. The rest is up to you, your taste, your preferences, and your experience. So please be patient and trust the process. Should you be using orchestral templates? The answer is that you should do what works for you. An orchestral template is an empty project with all the instruments of the orchestra ready to be used. And it can be a fantastic tool because setting up 30 or more instrument tracks in your DAW is time consuming and it can be distracting. It can interrupt that state of creative flow. Templates help with that because you can fill them with all the common instruments for each section and they'll be there for when you need them, plus some extra that you don't necessarily have to use. This can save you a lot of time and allow you to focus on the most important thing, which is the actual arrangement rather than setting up channels. Having said that, everyone is different, and some people find the template distracting. They prefer picking the instruments one at a time, and maybe they have many different libraries for each section, so for them there's no point picking this or that orchestral string library beforehand, because they might end up using a different one altogether for that track, so they'd rather have a blank canvas at the start of each new project. I would recommend that you give templates a try and see if they work for you. You can make your own from scratch, maybe more than one, depending what you write more often. And you can take one of your existing projects, then save it with a different name and use that as a template. If you do that, please be careful not to delete the old project. Perhaps make backup copies before fiddling with it. To summarize this module, listen carefully to your piano sketch and try to imagine what kind of arrangement will work for it. Take your time to learn about the different sections and familiarize with the tone of all the instruments. Pay attention to the distribution of the chords across the octaves. Pay attention to the voicing within each section. Don't neglect the violas. Don't neglect the woodwinds. Experiment with instrument combinations, woodwinds and strings, woodwinds and brass, woodwinds and mallets, etc. Be careful with the low end. Don't clog the lows and lower mids with an excess of low instruments. Remember that orchestration is trial and error, so be patient and allow yourself the opportunity to play with different ideas.